Okay, today I'm going to be showing you how to change the fork seals on this here CBR 600. Normally it's a lot more complicated than it's going to be because you've got a fairing and a fairing frame and bits and pieces in the way, but it's a part for other reasons. I'm doing other things to it, so it makes it easy to get the forks out and it makes it easy to show you the pinch bolts on the yokes and things like that. So Benji, bring your camera over here. The bike's on an ABBA stand. I'm going to strap the back wheel down in a second to get the front wheel completely off the ground and free. And in a nutshell, I'm going to take the brake calipers off, take the front wheel spindle out. I'll show you this in the process of doing this in a second. Take the front wheel out, then the pinch bolts for the yokes. There's two on the bottom yoke, one for each fork. Two on the top yoke, one for each fork, and then pinch bolts for the handlebars, and then the forks will slide out. So I'll show you that as we go. And then over here, we've got all the bits we're going to need to do the job. The obvious things, we're going to need some fork seals, and we're going to need fork oil. Always a good idea to have some clean rags at hand, because there is going to be some spillage, no matter how spillage of fork oil, no matter how careful you are. And then some special tools. Now some people try and do their fork seals without having the proper tools. It's a bad idea. Just invest in the proper tools. It makes the job so much easier. So in here we've got a fork seal driver like so, and we'll show you this in action. We've got a damper rod bleeding tool. I'll show you what that does later on. We've got a fork spring compressing tool which compresses the fork spring. Again, I'll show you what that does. That actually isn't going to be used. That's a special socket for Öhlins forks. And then there's a fork oil level adjusting tool. Again, I'll show you that as we go. So that's just a quick overview of what you're going to need. Chuck it back in there for now and we'll get the bike stripped.
Any top tips yet, Jim?
No top tips. There is a top tip coming up in a moment, which is a super duper top tip. It's such a good top tip that I forget to do it myself sometimes. Oh, you're having a giraffe. Okay, top tip number one. Before you take the forks out, before you loosen the pinch bolts on the yokes, it's always a good idea to loosen the fork caps first, because they're often really tight. In this case they're not that tight, but it's often quite difficult to get a good grip of the fork stanchion in the vise, so slacken them off first when they're being held by the yokes, and it makes life a lot easier later on. Okay, next thing is to undo the pinch bolts on the yokes. Now normally there's a fairing and everything in the way here, but this, as I said earlier on, this is a part for other reasons, so these bolts are usually quite difficult to get at. You've got to get your hand up underneath the fairing and have a bit of fight with a spanner, but in this case it's nice and easy. So undo those lower pinch bolts, and then there's pinch bolts on the top yoke, which in this case are Allen bolts. So you loosen those both sides, and the handlebars in the way. Have to edit that bit out, mate, or beep it or something. Slacken that off. Okay, the pinch bolts are all loose now, so the fork's ready to come out. Bring your camera over here, Benji, and just have a quick look at this. It's always a good idea before you loosen the pinch bolts with most bikes to just pay attention to how far the fork is protruding out of the top there. In this case, it's got a little metal clip on it, as you can see, so it's only ever going to go in one place, but with some bikes that clip isn't there, and you can end up putting the fork in various different positions. So it's a good idea, just measure the depth. I think I mentioned it on the how to change steering bearings video, but it's quite important, just pay attention to that before it comes apart. So remove that clip, and then the fork will just slide out. Keeping hold of the handlebar, just let it dangle, make sure it's not bashing into anything. Job done, forks are out. this might sound really obvious, but when you're doing fork seals it can get really messy, so it's always a good idea to put a lot of paper towel down or rags or something to catch all the oil. You can find yourself paddling around in oil really easily, so try and keep it as tidy as you can. Okay Benji, next thing to do, put the fork in the vise. There's a bolt in the bottom here that holds in the damper rod. It can sometimes be a nightmare to get out. That was easy. Sometimes it's a nightmare to undo.
Is that the same with all forks?
Well, not all forks. Some forks are, the way they go together, some upside down forks are different, but most right way up forks, you do know the difference between an upside down and a right way up fork, don't you?
I think so. Explain it to me just
This is a fork.
Yeah.
Okay. It's the right way up, as in the shiny bit, which is the stanchion,
Don't do
is
that
at
again.
is at the top, right? You see a lot of forks that are that way up. This bit is clamped in the yokes here, and then the wheel's connected to this bit.
Oh,
See what I mean? That's an what you would consider to be an upside down fork.
Understood.
Right. So, in the vise, undo this bolt. If it doesn't come undone, the best way is with an impact gun. Just shock it out.
What if you haven't got an impact gun?
You could use an impact driver, or you can take the other end off and take the damper rod out, and then you can get a holding tool which holds the damper rod, so you can undo the Allen bolt without the damper rod turning. But it's much easier just to somehow get that bolt out. Right, so we'll take this bolt out and then we'll drain the oil out.
Now, have you just tipped that fork up slightly so that you don't spill oil everywhere?
I've just tipped this fork up, that's correct. Because as I pull the bolt out, look, here comes the bolt. Not that it's that interesting. There's always a copper washer on them as well. So, bolt out. Fork out the vise.
I find that sound really funny.
It's because you're a child. Okay, that's the oil drained out. It's always a good idea if you're going to put things in a vise that are made of aluminium to use aluminium soft jaws, because otherwise the metal jaws of the vise will make a right mess of whatever you're getting hold of. Can we consider that a top tip? Probably not.
I'd say that was a middle tip.
A middle tip, not a top tip. Okay. Benji, come over here.
Is that the first time you've been stood in front of an erect shaft like that, is it?
Your penis. Right, the next thing. Pop up the dust seal, which hasn't been out for a long time by the looks of it. Pretty manky in there. Now, if you can look down there, I don't know whether you can see, there's a little wire clip, look.
Yeah, check.
Pull that out. That's what holds the seal down into the fork. So we get rid of those. Okay. Now we've drained the oil out already, and I've got some rag over the end of the fork to stop it from dribbling everywhere. So what we do is we turn the fork around, put it in the vise, like so. Okay, so now the clip and the dust seal are out of the way. The bolt's out the bottom of the fork, which is holding the damper rod in. We've got rid of most of the oil. We use the fork stanchion now, like a slide hammer, to pull the seal out. You can see the seal here.
Yeah.
Just starting to come out. And there it comes. So it comes out. The seal, there's always a washer. And then there's two bushes. This top bush and then a bottom bush on the fork stanchion. Yeah?
Check.
Okay, and out it comes. When you pull the fork apart, there's a little piece that's usually left inside the bottom of the fork. It sits on the end there, so it's probably down in here. I tip this up. There we go. And that little piece there fits on the end, like so. Sometimes it's really well stuck in the bottom, all the oil sludges in the bottom, and people don't realise it's in there, and then they try and get the fork back together, and it causes problems.
So what is it?
It's a seat for the damper rod, basically. It's like an aluminium piece that sits in the bottom. It's in a cup to hold.
Oh, I see.
Cup to hold that. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the next step is to strip the rest of the fork. So we'll remove the cap, which we loosened while it was in the bike to make life easier, like so.
Well, I never knew the inside of a fork looked like that.
Did you not?
No.
The next thing is to clean everything, ready for reassembly. Need to pay particular attention. Bring your camera over here. Down in the fork bottom, can you see down in there?
Yeah.
There's always a massive build-up of congealed black oil down there, so use a pump bottle and some brake cleaner, and you can spray down in there and clean it all out nicely. Okay,
Jim, why do you look like a Borg?
I've got my mechanic cam on, mate.
Oh, lovely.
Look.
See, now if I don't put that in,
That will look really
you
silly.
just look like Tommy Cooper or something.
Anyway, everything's clean, ready to go back together. Have a look in there. That was all full of horrible black mush before, so it's all clean, ready to go back together. So the process of reassembly is fork bottom in the vise, a little bit of silicone spray, slide that in first. Got some new fork seals, bush, washer, clip. Now then, first thing, drop the bush on. Okay. Now we'll get it started. Just initially, do you want to come over and have a look at this, Benji?
Yeah, you come around that way.
So you drop the bush down.
And the bush is...
The bush is the top bush. There's two bushes. There's a bush attached to the stanchion,
Yeah,
which runs up and down inside the fork bottom.
check,
And then there's this bush, which I've just dropped down,
check.
which you've just seen me drop down, which sits in the top of the fork there. So you just push it slightly and just get it started into the hole it's going to fit into.
Okay.
Yeah. Then you drop this big washer on. Fork seal driving tool. And the weights. And knock the bush in. Yeah.
Okay.
Next thing, new seal. It's actually genuine seal. It comes with some grease already on the lip, which is good. So I haven't got to mess around gripping it. Now, if you look up here, see how there's this groove?
Yeah.
It would be a really bad idea to push that seal over that groove, because the sharp edge of this might just take a nick out the seal.
Okay.
So the thing to do, you can use a little plastic bag or something if you want, but just put a little bit of tape around the top of it.
That's a top tip, isn't it, Jim?
Well, it is actually, yeah, it's literally a top tip. And I just put a little bit of silicone spray on it, and then the seal will slide over nice and easily without getting damaged by that sharp edge.
Understood.
Yeah? Okay, slide the seal down. Wipe that off. push it down as far as you can with your fingers, making sure it stays nice and flat. Yeah, you don't want it starting to go crooked, because when you try and bash it in, you'll deform the seal. Okay, use the fork seal driver again. Knock the seal all the way down home.
Will you know when it's all the way in?
You can usually feel, you can tell when it's moving, and then it gets to a point where it won't go anymore.
Okay.
And you can actually tell by looking, because the groove that the circlip sits in appears. So we've got this metal clip that sits in, and as we push it in, oh sorry Ben, you can see it sits in a little recess. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you know the seal's all the way down, and if the seal's all the way down, the bush is also all the way down, because it's such a tight fit between the bush, the washer and the seal, and the circlip.
Right.
So if you can get that clip in easily, it's all where it all should be.
Check.
Okay, job done. And then the dust seal, making sure it's nice and clean down in there. The dust seal will almost go in by hand. Might need a little bit of gentle persuasion, but they're not normally that tight. Just, yeah.
Okay.
That's the seal fitted. Now we've got to reassemble the insides and fill it up with oil. Okay, damper rod assembly's got to go back in. The cartridge assembly rather has got to go back in. It's actually going to come apart once it's back in, which sounds weird, but you'll see when we fill it with oil. We've got to take this cap off the end and take the spring off to get the oil level in the fork right. But as it is now, we'll just put it together. So this cap goes on the end. Remember the one that was lost in the bottom of the fork when it came apart? So we slide that in all the way down to the bottom. And then we've got this bolt, which I've cleaned. You sometimes have to jiggle the damper rod around to get it lined up so you can get the thread started. Screw that so it's all the way home. Now, as with when it came apart, it might be that as you try and tighten this bolt up, the damper rod turns. In this case it isn't, so it makes life easy. But again, you might need to use an impact gun just to shock it to get it tight. So, now I'm sure there's a torque setting for that, but I've got a torque wrench built into my elbow, so I don't need one. Just nicely nipped up.
You said nipped.
Okay. Okay, now what we need to do is fill it up with oil, but before we can do that, we've got to take this assembly apart. Now the process of doing that, there's a damping adjustment screw on the top here. You've got to make sure that's screwed all the way in, so you can see it moves easily. So you wind it in till it hits the stop. Don't force it in, but just enough to know that it's seated all the way home. You need to crack this off. So one spanner on the lock nut, one spanner on the top of the preload adjuster, and then there'll be a big long rod inside here.
Is there a top tip in, Jim?
Yeah, get a higher ceiling in your workshop. So we pull this out of here like that. Put it safely to one side. And the other bits and pieces, just pay attention so you know how it goes back together. It's always a good idea just to lay everything out in order as it comes apart so you know. Then we've got the spring as well. Okay, now it's all apart. springs out, preload adjuster and everything's off the top of the damper rod, we can fill it with oil. Okay, ready to fill it with oil now. Got the fork spring out of the way, got the fork spring preload adjuster off the top of the damper rod, all the bits out of the way. Now, something worth mentioning probably is it's normally the case that you would measure the air gap to get the fork oil right. Do you know what an air gap is, Ben?
I know what an air gap is.
Do you?
It's a gap of air, isn't it?
It is, exactly that, mate, yeah. So if I was measuring an air gap to get the oil level right, I would fill the fork up with oil to a point. Let's say my air gap was 120 mil. I'd measure down from the top of the fork here, 120 mil down, and then there's a device that you slide inside that measures, touches the top of the oil.
Okay.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
So you get the right gap of air. This is a fairly crude, old-fashioned fork, and they don't give you an air gap, they just give you an oil quantity,
Right, okay.
which is 475 mil.
How do you know that?
How do I know it's 475 mil?
Yeah.
Because I've got a little book that tells me.
Oh, right, okay,
Yeah?
fair enough. Yeah.
So I've got the right grade of fork oil, and it's graduated on the side there, so I know how much I'm pouring in. So, without my face.
No, I want your face in it. You look ridiculous. That does actually look ridiculous. That's good, it's good.
How ridiculous?
Don't know, just do it again. Do it again from a different angle then.
Okay, so I've got 475 mil of oil in it. The only other thing I need to do is, with this tool here, is screw this onto the damper rod and very, very carefully raise the damper rod up and down. And what that does is that bleeds all the air out of the damper rod. See how the oil's coming out now?
So that gets rid of all the...
That gets the air out of the cartridge.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Be careful to not get a face full of oil when you're doing it, like I did in rehearsals. See, now the air stopped coming out now, I'm just getting oil. Okay.
Okay. So these special fork seal replacer type tool things.
Fork seal driver, Ben.
Yeah. Are they available from you?
They are, yeah. You can buy them on my website if you like.
Are they expensive?
Not massively. The fork seal driver, the universal driver, which is that and this piece, they're about 60 quid, I think.
All right. Okay.
This here, which we haven't used today, you'd use that with upside down forks. That's about the same, about 45, 50 pounds. And that's about a tenner. So not massively expensive.
Cool.
And then there's this here, which we haven't used. We were talking about doing the fork oil level.
Yes.
Well, you'd get this tool and you'd make it work. So you'd measure from the end of that to that flat,
Yeah.
yeah, and tighten it up, let's say, I don't know, 100 mil, whatever the air gap is. You'd drop that inside the fork, like that, and then you get a syringe and you suck the oil out,
Okay.
and obviously it sucks the oil to that level,
Yeah.
and then you've got exactly the right air gap.
Right.
But in the case of this fork, we haven't got to worry about an air gap, we've just got 475 mil of oil to put in it.
Cool.
Yeah?
And the air gap is a very important.
It is, I mean, take it to the extreme. Imagine if you had no air gap,
you wouldn't be able to compress the fork.
the fork would be solid, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
So it's kind of like a bump stop, if you
Yeah.
like. As the fork compresses, the oil level's going up, and it's compressing the air in that air gap.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So it's effectively your bump stop. So the bigger the air gap, the more likely the fork is to bottom,
Cool.
or the easier the fork is, and it gives the spring a progressive rate. You see what I mean? So as the fork compresses, it's compressing it's generating more and more
I know.
resistance, isn't it?
Yeah.
As the fork compresses, so it stops the fork from bottoming out. Okay, back together then. Spring back in first, like so. We use this damper tool to rescue the damper rod from down inside, like so. Washer. That's why it's important to lay everything out, because then you know, you haven't got to think, ooh, how did that go back together? Got that. Another washer. I've got this little cup here. Now with most forks, when you take them apart, especially with upside down forks, all this is under a massive amount of tension. You know, the spring is pushing up on there really, really hard, and it's difficult to get apart.
Yeah.
And that's what this tool is for. With an upside down fork, you'd have a couple of holes in this tube here, and then you'd screw these in, and then it gives you something to pull the fork down with. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. What we'll do is we'll tip this a little bit. Now then, the reason, remember I said screw this in all the way?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, the reason for that is, when it goes back together, remember the taper on the end of that needle?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, what we want to do is, as we screw this in now, we're going to seat that needle, that taper on that needle, onto its seat. So see how it just hits home, hits a stop.
Right, okay.
Yeah? And then this lock nut, you just come around here with your camera. So this seats nice and gently, and then we bring this lock nut up to meet it.
Okay.
Yeah? And lock it in that place. So we know it's in exactly the same position as it was when it came apart.
Understood.
Yeah?
Very exciting.
Not really. And then it's as simple as lifting that up and screwing it all together.
Almost your hammering face there.
Right, it's my pushing face. Not quite as dramatic as the hammering face. And then do this up just to the point where it seats, and then you can, when it's back in the bike, you can just nip it up properly so it's nice and tight. But there's no need to go mad now, just nip it up so it's together. And there we have it.
Excellent.
Did you learn anything?
Yeah, I know what a progressive spring looks like now.
What else did you learn?
What is this, a test?
Yes.
Air gaps.
Well done.
Air gaps. I really do actually feel under pressure.
That concludes today's lesson.
Excellent. Other shoe this time. Amazing.
You're not filming, eh? There's no end to my talents, mate. I tell you, I can tie both my shoes up.
Would you be able to do the laces up on my wellies?
I could probably put laces in your wellies for you. It wouldn't be very waterproof, though. Right, I'm going to put these forks back in quickly because we want to go home. So, top tip,
Yes.
and this might sound really ridiculous, but I've done it many times. Make sure you get the right one on the right side and the left one on the left side,
Oh, right, okay.
because
Right.
obviously the caliper mount is different,
Yeah.
and it sounds silly, but often you put them in and you think, yeah, that's definitely right, definitely right. Then you go to put the wheel in or the calipers on, you think, hang on a minute, that's definitely not right. So in this case it's fairly easy because it's dirty on the inside and you know the caliper goes at the back, but some bikes it's slightly more confusing. So what we'll do is make sure it's nice and clean in here. It is. I mean, it looks a little bit dirty, but it's nice and smooth. Yeah.
Check.
Check. Little bit of something on them just to help them slide in. Okay. Now, as with, I think we did with it when we did steering bearings, didn't we?
Yeah.
Make sure you get the cables and wires and stuff the right side of the fork when it goes in.
Okay.
Yeah, because obviously that is not the right way.
Yeah, understood.
And it's sometimes easy to get one way, one the other if you're not
Paying attention.
So slide it in, handlebar on the top, like that. Now with these it's easy. If you look on the bench there, I've got these little wire clips. So put a little wire clip on the top of the fork there, like that. Yeah?
Yeah.
And then it sits in place perfectly. So I haven't got to measure, because with some bikes they're just free to go wherever they like.
Okay, understood.
But there's a wire clip there, so it's easy peasy. Just do the pinch bolts up, just loosely. Just hold it in place. Notice here, there was a cable tie around the fork. With these brake lines I haven't bothered trying to force the fork through it, I'll just cut it off and put a new one on.
Your breathing's funny just then as well.
Always wash your pole before you stick it in.
Yeah, absolutely.
In petrol.
And also grease it up as well.
Right, that's it then, Ben. All done. One thing to remember is, remember we wound these damping adjusting screws all the way in?
Yeah.
Well, don't leave them like that. The best starting point is when they're wound all the way in, there's a little punch mark on them, so you can see this little dot?
Hang on. Oh yeah.
Yeah? So what we need to do is count the number of turns out. So 1, 2, call it 2.5
Right.
for the sake of argument. And then we want to set it, well, set them both the same, somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to go 1.25. Yeah?
Okay.
So that sets the damping somewhere in the middle. And I'll do the same on this side. 1, 2, 2.5 the same. So 1.25. So they're set somewhere in the middle of the damping range. And you can have, obviously, you know, setting suspensions, a whole nother episode that gives you a starting point. If you left them wound all the way in and went for a ride, it wouldn't be good. You wouldn't enjoy it very much.
Cool.
So that's it.
Excellent.
Happy? You learned something?
I've learned a lot,
Or not?
and I shall look forward to the next one.
I'm not sure I will. Happy days. Do you ever turn the camera off?
Not really.
God, don't ever work with this man. He's a nightmare. Can we have a bacon butty now?
Yes.
Let's go.